Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Bianca Mieses. I identify as Black, Afro-Latina, and my pronouns are she and her. We are really, really excited for today's event and excited that you decided to join us today to bridge the gap. So we are YEA Collective, and we're a group of youngish folks focused on equity in all things. And we connect a network of young change makers to facilitate collaboration across equity intersections and advocate for equity in all places that we show up. So this series particularly, we would like, it's called the Bridging the Gap series. It's to host conversations at the intersection of race and other groups, identities, and experience with the intent to build community across the gaps that exist. Today specifically, we are going to be exploring race equity in the LGBTQ plus community and serving as facilitators in a discussion between community leaders and the communities they serve. Like in so many other spaces, movements, and communities, the queer community is first and foremost a safe, inclusive space for white people. And people of color, per usual, feel less welcomed and protected than they could. Nationally and locally, queer people of color have had to make their own spaces because they just don't feel included or empowered in other spaces. So when we look at our current LGBTQ plus community and see racial disparities, we need to understand that there's a historical context. And as always, and in order to move forward, we need to understand where we've been in order to move forward. And I will pass it over to our YEA Collective member, Fivecoat.
Hey, everybody. I am super excited to talk to you all today. I want to introduce myself first. I identify as a white, transmasculine, non-binary person, and my pronouns are they, them. I'm really excited to talk about the gap at intersection of racial equity and the queer community. And I'm going to touch on a lot of key figures, events, and places throughout history of the queer rights movement, but there will be a lot left out, and I apologize for that, but we will provide links in the chat and maybe a link with all of those links later. But I just want to give everybody a jumping point to learn more. I want to acknowledge that I am white, and I'm going to be speaking on a few things that aren't my own lived experience. But again, my intention is just to provide some historical context that has helped me and will hopefully help you to continue learning. I also want to acknowledge that in some cases, I'll be using terminology that's outdated and can be pretty offensive today. But as we learn more and more about ourselves and build language, it's important to remember that people in the past didn't have that privilege, and they had different terminology back then. And I want to identify them the way that they identified when they were alive. And lastly, I want to warn everybody that some of the content is pretty heavy. It can be upsetting and unsettling. So if you're not in the right headspace to listen to this right now, I welcome you to rejoin in about 10 minutes. So I'll give you guys a second to jump out if you need to. Okay, so let's jump in. Many of the people and examples we'll be covering centered around the 1950s to 70s. So I want to give a little bit of legal context to that time. Queer people were not allowed to join the military, work for government, wear clothing that didn't match their assigned gender, show affection, drink, dance, and a lot of other things. These laws were barriers to entry that just furthered more to be created. They forced the community to break laws in order to simply exist. So Stonewall is a really good example of that. Many people know the word Stonewall, but a lot of people don't know that it was a mafia-run gay bar. The LGBTQIA plus community didn't have many options other than to affiliate with notoriously criminal organizations in order to just have a place to dance and drink and be with their loved ones. In 1953, President Eisenhower incited what was called the Lavender Scare, which was intended to remove queer people from government positions. This scare spread throughout the country and the communities and forced the community to organize. So we saw the rise of what were called homophile societies at the time. And some of these were known as the Mattachine Society, Daughters of Bilitis, ECHO, and the Janus Society. And there were many others. But over the years, we could see that they had shifting strategies and goals. And what's really interesting to look at is how those strategies and goals shifted alongside the civil rights movement. A really good example of that is the March on Washington in 1963, was followed just 2 years later by the first gay rights picket in front of the White House. And in the years between the protests at the White House and Stonewall Uprising, there were several other riots that are very notable, and I encourage everybody to go and do some more research on. These are things like the Cooper Donuts riot, the Compton Cafeteria riot, the Black Cat Tavern riot. But today we're going to focus a little bit more on the Stonewall Uprising, as it's a little bit easier to find information on that. So, located on Christopher Street in Greenwich Village, a notoriously queer neighborhood, Stonewall's lived a pretty long life. It's still open today, but it's been through a bunch of different phases. It has always been a refuge for our community and has been the place of many protests. Similar to our Mafia fact a little bit ago, another piece of information a lot of people don't know about the bar was that it was essentially segregated from front to back. The front room was commonly referred to as the white room, and it had its own bar and dance floor. And the back room was commonly referred to as the Black or Puerto Rican room, and it also had its own dance floor and a smaller bar. At different points in history, Stonewall was known to different people as different things, but at the time of the uprising in 1969, it was a really common place for street queens to gather. And street queens were young, mostly houseless, gay, trans feminine, and commonly people of color that took the brunt of police harassment. So on June 28th, at 1:20 a.m., Deputy Inspector Seymour Pine of the 1st Division of Public Morals raided Stonewall without warning. Raids were pretty commonplace back then in gay bars, but bars like Stonewall usually had a heads up because they paid off the police. Pine set out to end that practice, and he ordered a warrant to raid and literally disassemble the bar. I want to note that his intention was to literally have the physical bar picked up and removed. I don't know what he thought would happen by doing this, but he clearly thought it would be effective. As he entered the bar, he had 3 other officers with him, and they started gathering people based on their gender expression into different rooms to be examined. The crowd was larger than normal that night, and they weren't having it. They started resisting, which was a little bit unusual. What came next was an unexpected uprising for everybody involved that would force the police to barricade themselves inside the bar. And now, ever since that night, people have sought to give credit to the person responsible for inspiring the crowd to take control. And I want to emphasize that in almost every account of who threw the first punch, the first bottle, the first anything to start the uprising, were almost all people of color. And if these acts of resistance hadn't taken place, we would not be where we are today in history. It's really important to sit back and ask ourselves why they were willing to put themselves on the line for everybody that pushed them to the back room that night. An activist and community leader, Marsha P. Johnson, explained it really well when she said that after the 100th time of being arrested for gay crimes, she stopped counting. It was just too commonplace. So that night, it's safe to assume that when Marsha and people like her and all of the street queens felt the control that they had in the crowd, they knew that they needed to take advantage of that moment and shift the narrative. And an incredible example of their resilience was when the police riot line was approaching the crowd and the street queens are standing in front of them, high kicking and singing in a chorus line until they were about 8 feet from the police. And they finally broke and ran. But before that, they were in front of everybody. This happened actually multiple times throughout the few days of the uprising. So the uprising lasted for about a week, but the impact we still feel today. It's not a secret that Stonewall heavily influenced the foundation of Pride, but the road to get where we are has been complex, full of twists and turns. The first official Pride March was actually called Christopher Street Liberation Day, and CSLD was created by a group known as the Gay Liberation Front. One of the goals of Craig Rodwell, the founder of GLF, was to create a more accurate representation of the queer community. But despite these efforts, Pride would still have barriers to entry that people experience today. You'll hear in a few minutes the stories of struggle that each of our panelists have experienced in their participation with Pride. And with the information that we've covered so far, we can see clearly that the LGBTQIA+ community, and especially trans people and people of color, had to create their own spaces and systems that help them feel safe. And I'm going to talk about a few specific people who did a really good job of doing this. So despite their struggle to feel welcome as trans women of color in the queer community, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera kept persisting and creating spaces for other marginalized people. Each of their stories are absolutely incredible and deserve their own presentations, but I wanted to tell a little bit more about them, and hopefully you can use this as a jumping point. So Marsha identified as a Black drag queen, and in some cases, gay man and transvestite. Once again, the language is a little bit different back then, so she used a multiple different terms. So people often ask what the P stands for in her name, and she would always answer, it stands for pay it no mind. She was a central figure in the gay street scene until her death in 1994. She was often referred to as Queen Mother because of her efforts to help and protect her community. She was involved in nearly every New York queer rights event that I've done research on. And if it was happening, Marsha was there representing her community despite feeling unwelcome at many of these events. Marsha was murdered on July 6th, 1994 at the age of 46. Her body was found in the water at the West Village Pier, and her murder was never properly investigated. And we still don't know how the end of Marsha's life happened. Sylvia was a Puerto Rican Venezuelan trans woman. And like Marsha, she also identified as a gay man and transvestite during different periods of her life. Sylvia had an extremely difficult childhood and life. Her mother died by suicide and tried to poison Sylvia with rat poisoning at the same time. After her grandmother got sick, Sylvia ended up on the streets at age 10. By 11 or 12, she had been arrested for the first time for sex work. And she soon met 17-year-old Marsha while she was panhandling. Marsha took on a maternal role for Sylvia, and they had each other's backs for the rest of their lives. In 1970, Marsha and Sylvia founded what was known as Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, but was commonly referred to as STAR. They set out to create a home for trans people and other marginalized groups that weren't being adequately supported by other queer organizations. They started out with a trailer where they had housed over 24 young street kids. One day they were returning home with food and they saw their trailer being hauled off with those kids inside. Most of them got out. One of them didn't get out until they got to California, but one of their co-founders, Bubbles, helped them get cheap rent at a 4-room section of a mafia-owned building. And they stayed there for about 8 months before being evicted. Marsha and Sylvia worked really hard to create a safe life for these kids by doing sex work so that they didn't have to. They were just responsible for getting food. STAR would later expand to create chapters in Chicago, California, and England before ending their work 2 years later. Sylvia would go on later to start a similar organization called Transy House. And thanks to the incredibly hard work by Raina Gossett, a trans woman of color, we're able to hear the speech that Sylvia fought really hard to give on stage at the 1973 Christopher Street Liberation Day. We'll hear that in a minute. But on the day of the rally, Sylvia was trying to get on stage all day, and people wouldn't let her simply because of her appearance and her identity. She was beaten as she forced her way on stage, and the crowd tried to boo her off stage, but the speech that she would give and yell over the crowd would make an impact to this day. So we're going to hear a 30-second clip of that, but I encourage you all to listen to the whole thing afterwards.
But do you do anything for them? No, you all tell me to go and hide my tail between my legs. I will not put up with this shit. I have been beaten. I have had my nose broken. I have been thrown in jail. I have lost my job. I have lost my apartment for gay liberation. And you all treat me this way? What the fuck's wrong with you all? Think about that.
So after this heartbreaking, abusive day that Sylvia had, she wouldn't return to activism for about 20 years because she felt so betrayed by the movement that she fought so long and worked so hard for. She returned to activism in the mid-90s and was recorded saying, "The movement had put me on the shelf, but they took me down and dusted me off," she said. "Still, it was beautiful. I walked down 58th Street and the young ones were calling from the sidewalk, 'Sylvia, Sylvia, thank you. We know what you did.' And after that, I went back on the shelf. It would be wonderful if the movement took care of its own." Sylvia passed away on February 19th, 2002 at the age of 50. And she doesn't know this, but later this year, New York plans to unveil a monument to Marsha and Sylvia. And before I wrap up, I want to leave you with a quote that makes me feel really empowered to continue. It goes, "We stand on the shoulders of giants, and it's time we learn their names." So I know that was a lot of information, but I hope you all feel empowered to continue learning about our past so that we all know better what we can do better. So I'm going to pass it over to India to introduce our speakers, and thank you all for listening.
All right. I just want to take a minute before we go any further to say thank you to Em for doing all of that research and putting a lot of time and energy and love into that very condensed history. So shake it out really quick. All right. Hello, everybody. I'm so happy to be here in community with you all this morning, and I really appreciate you all showing up today. My name is India, and I identify as a non-binary multiracial queer, and my pronouns are they, them. I'll be facilitating this important conversation, but before I invite our panelists to introduce themselves and share their stories, I just want to take a minute for all of us to just kind of like take a couple collective breaths to like center ourselves and just kind of ground. So you want to soften your gaze or just close your eyes, whatever feels good to you. Just like loosen it up and just focus on your body and like do a little body scan and just let's breathe in through our nose and out through our mouth, sending that energy to any place in your body that's holding tension. Let's go in through our nose and out. And then one more time. All right, whenever you're ready, go ahead and bring your focus back to your screen and just settle in and let whatever stagnant energy you have, just kind of go. All right, so now I'd like to hand it over to our first panelist. I invite each of you to just tell us a little bit about yourself, your current positions and your purpose, and your lived experience as it relates to the intersection of your racial and queer identities. So I don't know who wants to go first.
Hi, my name is Tamara Leigh, and I identify as she, her. I use she, her pronouns. My journey. So I always get extremely emotional when I watch that video of Sylvia because it basically is the reason why I do the work that I do. I was blessed enough to be slow enough to not have really figured myself out and where I landed in terms of gender and sexuality until I was a little bit older. So I was an adult. I had gotten married, had started a family. So it took me a little longer to figure out who I was and that there wasn't just something broken in me, that I just didn't know who I was yet. And the reason why that was a blessing was because I had the privilege of being independent at the point that I was making those discoveries, and I didn't have to worry about being put out of my home or abandoned by my family in a way that would affect my ability to live. So it was mostly just that internal struggle of figuring out who I was. And when I finally was able to step into myself and my identity and understand the intersectionality that I lived in, it directly led me to the work. I had always worked with inner city youth and within the Black community to make sure that we were heard and seen and empowered and acknowledged, that our history mattered, that we knew our history, that we had space, that we had safe space. And so that sort of just transitioned with me as I stepped into the LGBTQ community, which I will say in New York, where I'm from, literally welcomed me with so much warmth and open arms that I will never stop being grateful. And the work that I do was kind of my thank you for that, because it was the first time I felt like I belonged somewhere and that people could see me and that they understood my experience and who I was. So I worked in PR and public relations for a very long time. And then I got this unique ability from working with the city where I lived and working with different organizations that I was approached about doing public relations for the first Black Pride that was being developed in our area. And over the next 5 years, that's what we did. We helped it grow. We educated the community about why it was important, that there is a uniquely different perspective and culture and energy and feeling and icons that came with the Black and brown queer community that didn't exist anywhere else, that it was really in so many ways where culture began for the entire country, not just for the LGBTQ community. Like no one quite says, like Sylvia, you know, Stonewall was where, it certainly isn't where gay started, but it's certainly where the gay rights movement caught wind. And its wings expanded. And that was a movement that was created and propelled by Black and brown queer people, mostly trans women and transient youth. They were throwaway kids that said no more. And that movement was pretty much corrupted by white Wall Street. And so I have found over the years that history forgets the people that they don't think are important, even if they were the heart and the soul and the background and the front runners in a movement, just about every movement and every American movement you can find. And so through Black Pride, I learned about educating and about creating safe spaces. I was eventually approached by another agency that was predominantly white about coming in and making change, creating change, and people didn't like me very much for it. The people that had started it were part of the Gay Liberation Front that were part of Stonewall. Upstate New York, a lot of people who left New York City went upstate New York to make families and homes. And Rochester, where I was from, was of the very conservative upstate New York community, was probably the most liberal when it came to LGBTQ. So the community followed upstate, and that's where I grew and entered the community myself. And so, you know, the agency had been pretty much designed for, run by, programmed for, advertised to old white cis men. And the executive director at the time knew that if there wasn't a corner turned there, that the agency would die. It needed to be reflective of the entire community. So I spent the next few years diversifying programming, the literature that was put out, the message that was sent, the language around the things that we presented to the community, making sure that the staff was diversified because it mattered that you walked in the door and saw someone that looked like you in the building. So the agency eventually, you know, got sick and died with COVID. And so I had to figure out what was next for my life. So early last year, I went on to establish Blackout Consulting. So I come into spaces, universities and businesses and teams and organizations and do this kind of work. We have this kind of conversation. We talk about the history that people are largely unaware of. There is a misnomer outside of the LGBT community that in an arena where homophobia doesn't exist or shouldn't exist, that things like racism and transphobia don't exist, and that's not real. And you have to be able to have these conversations to tackle it, to look at it, to see it, to figure out where the problems are, and to make reparations in order to heal and be able to really, in a real way, make the changes that count in an authentic and meaningful way. And so people call me in around the country to help them do this work within their organizations to make sure that safe spaces are really safe spaces for everyone. And when we say, you know, it's an LGBTQ safe space, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a safe space for Black people, and that intersection matters. And it's a conversation that needs to be had from multiple perspectives. So I started the consulting agency, and then we went on to start Blackout Magazine. Those are some of my covers behind me. For the same thing, to give Black and brown queer culture a voice and a platform that it often doesn't have elsewhere. And so that's the work that I do. So I made this huge life change and decided to move down to the Sunshine and found myself in St. Pete late last year and was desperately missing community. So I reached out to St. Pete Pride to see if I could get involved. And I suspected that based on many of the prides that I have done the same kind of work for, that there was probably quite a white wall there, because there generally is, to figure out how I could potentially be able to help do some of this work. And with my PR background, I could also help in that way as well. So since then, I have been working with the St. Pete team to see if there are ways that we can build bridges. But the thing that people misunderstand about burning bridges is that there has to be reparation first. First of all, this is not my first rodeo, so I understand that there are relationships and offenses that have inevitably been committed long before anyone that has anything to do with St. Pete Pride now was around. I'm brand new to the community. I'm brand new to Pride, so I don't know what they are. So it has to do with a lot of listening to figure it out, because until you acknowledge the mistakes that you made, until you really work to repair the damage that's done, there is no building bridges forward. So this is a unique and an opportunity that I'm extremely grateful for, because you have to hear the stories. You have to allow people to have their voice and talk about what's happened to them and to understand the experiences, because I can speak from a general intersectionality perspective, but that has nothing to do with what happened to real people in a real place with a real history. And so you have to hear that, you have to acknowledge it, you have to give it a platform in order for there to be any chance to grow. So that is why I'm here. I'm extremely grateful for the work that you're doing in general, because it's work that isn't happening in a lot of communities and needs to be, mostly because it gives people voices, and that's where everything starts. So that is me. I always like to say that I have heard just about everything, and the work that I do, like it's not everybody's job to educate you. It just isn't. People don't have to open their lives, their hearts, their experiences to what has happened to them. There's so much trauma related to that it's not fair to have an expectation of people to do that. But there are those of us that take that on, and I am one of those people. And so I try to be as safe a space as possible to be able to ask and answer questions. So through the course of this, when we get to the answer part, anything that anyone would like to ask, please feel free to do so. I am the person that is willing to do that, so you don't do it to the person who's standing next to you in line at Publix. So please understand that this, for me, is an open spot, and please feel free to ask me anything. And I will let you know if it's too far, but for most questions, I'm completely open to answer, and I'm happy to offer whatever perspective I can. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So I think after hearing that, I would like to pass it to Nathan to, tell us a little bit about yourself and, what your current position is, purpose, and all of that good stuff.
Position and purpose, not always the same thing, right?
Very true.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nathan Bruemmer. I use he, him pronouns. I am a white trans man of queer experience, born and raised in the Tampa Bay area. And I say Tampa Bay because I've spent as much time in Tampa and its outer parts and all across Pinellas County, but predominantly St. Pete and Gulfport for the better part of my life. I am still feeling the beautiful presentation that Em put together. For me, the intersection of my, personal experiences and sort of focusing on keeping it local, as opposed to, my experiences with Pride over my life, it's very complicated and also motivating to why I do the work. And the lives of both Sylvia and Marsha are just, because they were right before, I was born, and we lost them right as I was finding my voice. And, when I was forced out in high school in Tampa and was bullied to the point of, being kicked out, in essence, from my high school by a teacher who said, you won't amount to much and you don't belong here. And I don't think I've stopped hearing that, even since taking the leadership position as the president of St. Pete Pride, as one of the very few trans folks who have been allowed to, and because of my white privilege, to even be in a leadership position. And so the responsibility to lean in and push is one that I take very seriously. It is, realistically, I know it's why we've lost some volunteers this year, because there has to be intentionality about why we go forward with what our mission is beyond parades and parties. This is too important an organization to the community. We started 19 years ago because my hometown of Tampa, where I was born, told that pride organization to get out. They made it complicated and difficult to even host events. It's a sordid tale, and St. Pete said, "We welcome you." You know, and I spent years living in the Midwest where there were very different experiences at Pride. You know, I came out through a lot of identities, trying on lots of hats, as I sometimes say to friends. And I was up in Indiana when still presenting as female and wanting to go to the Michigan Women's Music Festival at a time that trans men weren't allowed. There was a lot of politicalization and a lot of lack of welcoming around that festival. And then I ended up moving out to Portland, Oregon, and experienced my first trans pride, which was separate, very separate, in a separate neighborhood, on a separate day. Seattle had created a pride, but Portland hadn't quite done the same to the same scale for the trans community. And I went to Portland to be in safe space to then come out as trans, because I couldn't do that in Florida. But I got to a time where I needed to come home. I lost my father and my brother, and I needed to come home to St. Pete to take care of my mom. And through about 2 decades of various experiences that said I need to, I guess, jump back into the fire. I had people on the board of St. Pete ask me to join for at least 2 years while I was in law school at Stetson. And I said no, because it was a white, gay, cis, male, middle-aged, upper middle class bubble. And I don't always feel safe. And I had tried, I didn't even attend all the prides when I was in law school because it wasn't welcoming for me. And recognizing there's so many communities that are feeling the same. And I made a conscious choice when I was asked after about 2 years of that, okay, but then what we're gonna do there needs to be intention around how we do outreach to the trans community and what we do. And I made recommendations that first year to do a trans event or a trans pride march, and was told to do it on a separate day in a separate place. And I had, I fought the board and I said no. And I had to fight the executive director, which was 2 executive directors ago, to sort of make that happen. So I won that battle, but there was a lot of resistance. And there's a lot of stories. That was 2017. And a lot of stories between now and then. I sort of stayed in that lane because that's what I could do, and that's been my focus and my advocacy. But we're in a very different moment, and there are a lot of new voices. Tamara's voice is one of the many amazing new voices that have come in. A lot of new folks new to St. Pete. That's part of where thematically some of the new programming is coming from, because we're sharing stories. And so I too look forward to the sharing of those stories. And I'll also sort of drop this, as I've talked to people, I've had this new experience this year, 2 things. A lot of people keep asking me why a straight guy's running Pride. And I've noticed a lot of people keep referring to this as just gay pride. And just sort of adding to the conversation, I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about that, but I'm sort of focused on the logistics. 2 weeks out from the first event. Well, technically Sunday's the first event, but the first festival is 2 weeks out. But I think, yes, this is a long overdue conversation that has many layers and many intersections. And I look forward to hearing too from community, as Tamara indicated, and working on it together, collectively. So Ex Indio.
Thank you. All right, and I'll pass it over to our third panel. I almost called you a finalist. You win. Rocky, go ahead and tell us about yourself, your story, your introduction.
Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Rocky. For those that do not know me, I am a community advocate. And can everyone hear me? Okay, yeah, I'm a community advocate. I founded an organization here called the Nine Colors Initiative about 5 years ago when I moved back to St. Pete with a group of friends of mine. And I'll kind of get into that after I finish my introduction. But yeah, I'm originally from St. Pete, born and raised. Been working in the community for I don't know, about 11 years. So still fairly new, but I guess I've been around long enough to know a little bit. I've been working in St. Pete again for about 5 years, with a little bit of experience with, different types of events. And I also come from ballroom. So a lot of my foundation starts from ballroom. Let's see. Ballroom is actually how I got into the business. When I moved to New York when I was 18 years old, and my gay father, he worked at GMHC, and I needed a job. So he kind of got me in as an intern at GMHC, and from working under him and that organization, they kind of laid a solid foundation for everything that I know now. And when I moved back to St. Petersburg, I noticed that there were a lot of things that were different. And again, me being from St. Pete, but as a child, you don't really pay attention to certain things. So when I came back as an adult, I realized that, again, there were issues that I would hear about that kind of hit a little differently, as far as, me living in New York and me experiencing having, friends and, extended family members or gay family members that were impacted by, homelessness or, being diagnosed with HIV and other ailments, and having resources there, and then me coming here and having the same type of, situations that I would see with my, my circle of friends, and them not having any resources or feeling comfortable, knowing where to go. Me and, some of these friends decided to start an organization where we would not only help those people find, care, but keep them into care and create an environment where they felt comfortable, create a group of people where they felt comfortable, talking to or even complaining to. Oh, sorry. But yeah, and so once I started becoming more vocal about the things that I noticed here and the things that kind of weren't right to me, at least, I was kind of placed on a pedestal where I felt like I kind of became a pawn. I felt like a lot of people would use me to speak on things that they necessarily wouldn't want to speak on because I didn't have any restraints due to, any particular affiliation with any organization. Because to me, my focus was the community. So I didn't care how much, money or what job was offered to me at that point. It was more so about helping the community, helping, these clients where, if they would go in to get tested or they would, have a case manager that, or like any of their doctors or, primaries that wouldn't make them feel comfortable, we would then address that situation either directly with that organization or, I would deal with it, at a higher level. And that was pretty much my main focus. And then I started trying to figure out how could I take it to the next level. So I started, again, me coming from ballroom. I had hosted events in ballroom balls where I would partner with metro or different organizations, some in Miami, some in Orlando, and some in other, states like Maryland and DC and North Carolina, Atlanta. I wanted to bring that same energy here because we have such an underserviced, community here, and we have so many people that are so talented and so interested in so many different things. And I feel like ballroom has always been that safe place for me to feel accepted, because I come from a community where I wasn't accepted. Unfortunately, I was one of those children who family didn't accept them, and then when I went to my community here, my community also didn't accept me because I came out in a time where, being homosexual was not socially acceptable like it is now. So I turned to ballroom, and they welcomed me with open arms, and I wanted to kind of extend that same energy here in St. Pete. So I started throwing balls. I started, promoting and working with, whatever organization that I could get with to, sponsor these events and just try to push the information into my community, because although we fight for equality, there's a big disconnect between my community and the majority. Where St. Pete, again, is predominantly, they focus, no matter what it is, whether it's bars or, finances, grants and funding, so forth and so on. It's pretty much pushed into the older white community, or demographic of people. And so I noticed that a lot of, people like me, we miss information. Like we, St. Peter's had PrEP for a long time, and I still have friends to this day that, are just now finding out about PrEP, or they've had, trans programs for quite a while. And, pretty much on a weekly basis, I'm introducing, a new trans person, to Metro, or sending them to a different organization where they can, start on their HRT or, get counseling. And I feel like, when I talk to these organizations, they say, well, the information is here, but we don't know how to get the information to these people. And, then when I come in, I tell them, well, this is a way that you could try, and it never has happened that way. So I kind of do it myself and try to, I guess, work the relationship between me and the organization just to make sure that my community is getting what's needed. So segueing from ballroom and having these working with these organizations through balls, I realized that we have one of the biggest prides, in the country, I believe, and it's really white. Just gonna say that it's really white. And I've been going to Pride since I was 14, 15 years old. And as a juvenile, I enjoyed it because I didn't know that there could be much more to it than what I was seeing until I got out and I experienced living in New York, or, living in Miami, or living in DC. And so when I came back and, I segued from ballroom and working with these organizations, I started to question myself and question these organizations, like, why don't we have anything for us? Why does Pride not feel inclusive? So I started trying to figure out ways to, either work with Pride or just create something for us to do, because like I said, yeah, it's not inclusive at all. It's like the parade is great, the vendor fair is great, being outside is great, but at night we have the bars and these different parties and environments that it just never has felt inclusive. A few years ago, I think 4 years ago, I threw my first event during Pride, because I got to a point where I was tired of reaching out to the past president and, you know, the other board members at that time, I would reach out every year, and I would get, I probably, in 5 or 6 years, I probably had got 1 or 2 email responses saying, thank you, we got your letter, or we got your email, and we'll get back to you. And nobody had ever got back to me. And then I would follow up and follow up and follow up until I got to the point where I was tired of chasing. So I threw my first event, and it went really successful. I did it probably with 4 days of promotion, and I rented out a club and I packed the club out, and it was the most beautiful thing that I had seen, because honestly, looking at Pride, I never expected to see so many, you know, Black and brown and Asian and even some white people, you know, that were missing this part of what could be going on. And then the next year we did it again, and, you know, it was even bigger. And then last year was COVID, of course, so there was no Pride. So this year I'm, you know, doing another event, and I hope that, you know, it grows even bigger. But my goal is to not create something separate. I've always wanted just for us to feel included. And I've even been approached by, you know, different organizations and, you know, asked, why don't I start a Black Pride? And I don't believe that there needs to be a Black versus white or a Black versus Pride, just period. It should just be one Pride if that's what the goal is. You know, if we strive for equality, then why do we have to have separate prides? Why do we have to feel, you know, as though we're not welcome? And so, yeah, my goal is to figure out or help figure out or get to a place where, you know, me and St. Pete Pride, or, you know, the other pillars in the community and St. Pete Pride can figure out a way of balance and trying to, you know, incorporate or work with each other so that it doesn't feel like, you know, we're this against this, which, you know, it has always felt. And yeah.
Thank you so much. You brought up a very interesting point that I wanted to get to later. So I want to ask Tamara, what are kind of your thoughts and feelings around Black Pride events? You know, you have your own experience with these, and how does it feel, you know, being in a city that has 2 prides that are divided by race? Where do you?
So the events aren't divided by race, the community is divided by race. So I think it's important to make that distinction. I have been a part of the agency job that I had. We ran the 2nd largest Pride in New York State after the city. So it was huge, hundreds of thousands of people. And it was predominantly white, because across the country, prides are predominantly white. It's a thing. So I had started at Black Pride, and that's why they had asked me to join that Pride to help with this and change that dynamic. But I want to be careful to say that Black Pride and a traditional Pride don't have to be competitive. I think that there are very important reasons why both exist, because the history is different. If you ask most people in the LGBTQ community, they have no idea what ballroom is. Couldn't tell you what ballroom, never stepped in a ball. I actually threw a ballroom 101 class and had people coming thinking that they were gonna waltz in an LGBTQ center because they had no clue. Like, that's Black queer culture. There's a different story there. There's a different message. There's a different experience. And so celebrating that and uplifting that and making sure that those things last the test of time, that people know their history, is not necessarily ever a knock to a traditional Pride. So there are and not to mention the fact that there needs to be safe Black spaces that are just for us, period. And so I never want to discourage, do a either or. I think that they can live in community together. And I think that traditional prides can uplift Black prides and make them a part of what they do and celebrate the fact that they exist without feeling like they need to squash them out because they're competition, because it's really not. It's all about educating and celebrating culture. And the queer Black and brown culture has some nuances that don't live inside of the general typical LGBTQ community. So I just want to say that because I think it's important to know there can be both and it not be competitive. However, in its ideal state, you still have this traditional pride that's always huge, much bigger than any other smaller group. And it's important for everyone. I mean, the idea behind pride and the purpose of pride is to create these spaces for people to come and be in part of community. If you've ever been at a pride, like there's nothing like it. That feeling that you can just be 1,000% authentically you in a space with thousands of other people who are doing the same thing is like the dopest thing on earth. Like it's a feeling that you can't replicate many other ways. And no matter what pride you go to across the country, across the world, that's the case. But you can't create what is considered a safe space unless everybody who's a part of your community feels safe there. And that is often not the case. And you have to make purposeful, intentional decisions to make sure that everyone feels safe in those spaces. And without them, the pride that you're creating isn't authentic. Because if it's not safe for everybody, it's safe for nobody. It's just like if we aren't all free, none of us are free. Same concept. And so I don't think they ever have to be competitive. I think that they can work together. I think that traditional pride should always support Black prides, and they should support Black pride events, because again, we need spaces just like the LGBTQ community needs safe spaces that's just for us. The Black queer community needs the same thing, especially since we have traditionally and historically not felt safe in most spaces. And the other part of that conversation is people don't always realize with intersectionality, like if you're Black and queer, if you're a person of color and queer, you often are too gay to be fully accepted in your ethnic community. So you're too gay to be accepted fully in the Black community and too Black to be fully accepted in the LGBTQ community. So where do you live? Where does that intersection of people live? And in some cases, we have to create our own spaces in order to find that safe space. Ideally, however, you have a pride organization that acknowledges that fully understands that wants to correct that and make sure that the space that they create, that in the larger space, is comfortable and safe for everyone. But that takes a lot of work. And beyond taking work, you have to have a full understanding of what that means and why it's important to even really put real effort behind that work. And that's just not something everybody's ready to do. And you can't half-ass it. Like you have to be willing to acknowledge it, to name the puppy, to say, this has been a problem. We haven't done this right. We're doing it right now. Tell us what you need. We will figure it out. And this is what we want. And then even still, sometimes there's so many, sometimes people have experienced so much trauma that it'll never feel like a safe space for them. And that's unfortunate, but you also have to acknowledge that, because some people have just experienced so much in a lifetime of being in those shared spaces that they'll never feel safe there. And that'll never be a place where they feel celebrated and that they can enjoy. But that never should ever stop the effort behind it. You just keep trying, you keep building, you keep making progress, you keep inviting the community in to talk about what they need, and then you listen to them when they say it. When Rocky said that part about like, they continue to keep saying what they needed to reach the, like, I don't know how many organizations I've had tell me, oh, well, we don't know how to reach the Black community. We don't know how to reach the Black queer community. Did you ask them what they need? And when they told you what they needed, did you do what they said? Because it's really easy to miss that, giving people what you think they need instead of asking them what they need and then providing that. And so that takes time, it takes effort. It takes a lot of getting shot down, because there's a history there that doesn't disappear just because you decided it's time to do something different and you want to be looked at it a different way. It takes work, hard work, and consistency, and keeping reaching out and keeping making those changes, and keeping to make sure you see Black people on flyers, and keeping to make sure there's Black performers at events, and keeping to make sure that you're reaching out to other people that are doing events to make sure that they understand that they are welcome and lifted in that space. It takes work. You got to think, if it's hundreds of years worth of damage, that doesn't get fixed because you decided it's important, 5 years ago. It could take 300 years to fix the damage that was done over the last 100. Like, it's just consistent effort and knowing that it matters and just continuing to just show up and do the work. And some people that you'll be able to build a bridge with, and some people you won't. But it doesn't make it any more or less important whether they do or they don't. You do the work because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I want to ask Nathan, so Tamara's shared a lot about a lot of the barriers to entry in queer spaces, and specifically related to racially equitable spaces. What are some of the barriers that you've encountered? I've heard you name a couple of them, into, creating more racially equitable spaces. So what have been some of those, biggest barriers to entry, and kind of what are the steps, like what do you need in order to, is this conversation, like a connection point? So.
Yeah, a lot. So I asked a lot of questions when I first joined the board in 2017. So I joined right after the decision was made to move the parade downtown. So the first season after the Pulse tragedy, and a lot of things changed, and there was a lot of discussion and focus on that. And often when you ask, okay, well, what are you all doing around EDI initiatives? They're excuses. And so I came in with an intention to do outreach for the trans community and intersectionally, and fought that battle and asked what else we were doing around race or around accessibility, serving disability, serving older community members. Because and just being a community organizer, I've heard criticisms around a lot of things. It's a big event. Like 2019 season had over 265,000 people. We have a parking problem, and then we have a people density problem. And if folks are differently abled, getting down to the parade has been a challenge. And so I remember the first time I asked the question, and they sort of looked at me like, you solve it, because I'm the token trans guy on the board. And I said, we have to talk about this. And it seems like there is often in predominant white spaces to just be linear and thinking like we can only do the one thing that's in front of us right now, and getting past that to say we have to look at all of these things and do so all the time. And if you don't have a team that reflects your community, I don't think we can do that. I think it's an impossibility, because your experience forces a linear thinking. So I came in challenged and almost wasn't sure if I was going to stay. When I heard Rocky share his experience as an organizer and folks asked him, why don't you start a Black Pride? I got asked that question too. Why don't you start a Trans Pride? And for my community, there's no resource. Looking at disparities around, income and houselessness, I'm like, here's this big machine. I have to get inside and disrupt. It is the call, that it is the purpose. It's where our history began. And it's been way slower moving than I had hoped and wished. And prides are not always safe. I've been to a lot of prides that didn't feel safe. I didn't feel safe because whole host of reasons. I didn't feel safe because it's often the assumptions made. I've been in a lot of LGBTQ organizations and leadership positions. And so when I show up as a masculine person in an LGBTQ organization, I must be gay. I remember taking one of my first leadership positions and getting really physically harassed multiple times at the first event I showed up at, touched. And I know that happens consistently in spaces, a lack of sort of understanding to create that. In thinking about my trans and non-binary siblings, to say we have to not have gendered restrooms. We hosted our first Transtastic event, and I went to the brewery that was willing to host. That was a bit of a battle to say, I want to put up new signage and we have to talk to your staff about that. It's a little victory. And it was just a gathering for like 100, I think maybe 150 people showed up, but it was huge. I mean, so Tamara's right. It's a long collective push. Those are just a few examples, but there are so many. I can't, like, there's always resistance. There's always resistance.
Thank you. So what, I want to also pass this to all of you, but maybe Rocky, you can start. What, from your end, because you're on the other end of being the person reaching out, asking, you know, like, let's work together. What is that? Is the barrier to entry really just a lack of communication? Like, just, you know, there's no common meeting point. Like, what do individuals and the organizations need to do to appear and be more accessible? Is it an accessibility issue?
Honestly, I think it's a lack of respect that the majority has for, I guess I would say, the minority. And with myself, and I know this probably is going to sound a little weird, but I feel like the only reason why I've gotten as much done or have met, you know, most of the people that I've met is because of, you know, pretty privilege. I know how to, you know, use my looks to get in the door. I know how to, you know, smile and wink and flirt and, you know, squint my eyes to get past, you know, where others have been stopped at. And I feel as though, you know, although I have pretty privilege, it only takes me so far, especially dealing with, you know, older, you know, white gay men in, you know, executive positions, because they only want to hear what I have to say until they ask me to meet for drinks, or they ask, you know, to hang out outside of work. And it's like, that's not what I'm here for. And so then after that, you know, I lose all traction. I can't speak for, you know, anyone else when it comes to trying to get traction. But as far as me, that's what I have to deal with. And it doesn't just go with organizations. It's even, you know, club owners, and, you know, different community pillars that, you know, even we just had a new bar open, and I went and I spoke to one of the owners, and he pretty much dismissed everything I had to say to him. And so I have friends that work, you know, for that bar. And I asked him, I said, you know, do you guys have any Black staff? And my friend said, no, I don't think we do. I don't work, you know, every shift, but he's like, I haven't seen any. And then a week later, I come back and, you know, now they have, you know, the token Black bartender, and, you know, now they hire one dancer. But why does it take for, you know, me to say something to someone else, you know, as opposed to when I came and approached you directly? And, you know, I just wanted to talk to you because, again, with me being a, you know, promoter, and I do events, and I want to do more events for my community here, I like to form partnerships with bars, because I like to patronize within my community before I go outside of my community. But it's almost always easier to get a heterosexual, you know, club to buy into what I'm saying before I can get a, you know, a club that is LGBTQ plus based to even, you know, sit down and have a serious conversation. And I feel like if I were white, I probably would be taken a little more serious. And it doesn't matter, you know, what I wear or, you know, how I speak, because, you know, sometimes I'll go in and I'm dressed like I just walked out of a corporate office, and they treat me the same as if I had on a do-rag and, you know, sag my pants, which is sad, but, you know, it's true. And then it's only later when they hear, you know, through other people, like, you know, people that work for them, who I am and what I've done, and, you know, my experience in the community, then now you want to have a conversation with me. But it still always leads back to, you know, me being sexualized as opposed to, you know, my mission being taken serious.
Yeah, thank you. It's taking a minute to. What do you think? how do you think making changes then and not, finding solutions for, this year's Pride, because it is, it's fast approaching, but for, Prides to come, what can we as individuals and organizations do to create spaces that are more welcoming and equitable? And on top of that, how would the changes being made in Pride to create a more equitable Pride, what does that look like? What does that change look like in the community?
Can I take that one?
So,
Oh, I'm
yeah,
sorry.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead, Rocky.
Well, no, I just wanted to ask Nathan a question. So, are there any Black or brown people on the Pride committee or
Yeah.
board?
Not on the board, but on the operations committee, yes.
Okay, and are any of them, young, like 35 or younger?
I have no idea what anybody's age. I don't know Tamara's age. I haven't asked anybody their ages. I couldn't answer that, honestly.
Okay.
So that's a great answer or question, because the answer that I was going to say is it's all about having people at the table. You can do whatever on the ground floor. They always have us doing the footwork in the front, right? And it's great to be a promoter and throwing a party because everybody likes numbers and everybody likes dollars. And if you can bring people in the door, especially brown and Black people, to get numbers, organizations will fund you because they need those numbers. But it's about people being at the table. It's about diversifying the board. It's about diversifying not just the volunteers that are making the big decisions, but the people who are there when they take your ticket. Because I know that if I saw someone who looked at me when they walked up to the front gate, that would make a difference to me. And I would feel like I'm walking into a more inviting space. So it's all about, not only having people on the ground floor that are willing to do the work and the outreach, but also having people who are behind the scenes making the decisions, who know the people, who know the places, with the power of an organization behind them to be able to avoid things like you described, Rocky. Like, there shouldn't be any reason for that to happen. As much work as you've done and as much as you've established, you should be able to walk in the door with the same amount of respect as anybody else who comes behind it. But if you have an organization behind you that people do respect, that automatically opens doors for you, right? So it's about having people that look like you and look like me at the table, because there is linear thinking there, and people don't know what they don't know, and they don't know who they don't know. So it's about having people who have their ear to the ground, who are part of different representation of the community at the table. It all starts at the table. And we have to make sure that every organization is bringing people who are different and people who represent the minority and who represent the community that look like us, that we're at the table, because that's where the real decisions get made. And it never stops being important.
Can I chime in on that?
Yes.
Just to add to that, I agree. And the only thing that I want to add is that also what I've learned to be counterproductive is when organizations bring in people who aren't from, that targeted area in place of, someone there. Like, for example,
Totally agree.
I use Metro for an example, because I've worked with them, and Metro brought in, a friend of mine who has done great work in Orlando, and they brought him down, and he knows the business, he knows what he's doing, but he doesn't know the community. Mm-hmm. So he can only tell you but so much. And so, a lot of the time he refers back to me and say, hey, well, you know the land. You know where people hang out, how to talk to, the community, how to get answers, how to get, traction. I can only do so much. Yeah, I look like them, and, I may sound like them, but they're not going to respect me like they respect you, because you're from here. And, so say, for example, if I wasn't there, for him to, kind of give him that insight, he probably wouldn't be, as far, along as he is in his position. I'm not taking anything away from, what he does, but, that insight helped a lot.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
And was there anything you wanted to add to the,
Yeah.
the last wrap?
No, I hear a lot of, Rocky's experience, although mine is, based on assumptions of gender and Rocky's is based on race. It's the same, it is the same experience. And sometimes I suppose I wish I had a bit of a thicker skin because I feel that in my heart. And I was unaware, sitting as just a single board member without any position or authority, that, Rocky had even reached out before. So what matters is not only who is there, but who's sitting in what chair, like whether I think even somebody's listening or even has that awareness. So for that reason alone, I mean, we've had significant shifts in all of our, committees and all of our volunteers in the last 6 months. So what we did and how we gathered when we sort of met with the city as I stepped in at the end of the year and didn't really have a plan or a decision point with the city to move forward until like the week of Super Bowl. It's doing a lot of work in a very short period of time. And so I guess your question was sort of like, what can we do? So, I mean, what I hope to do, and leaning in and being from the area and having the relationships I have and hoping to make those relationships stronger and meet new community members is to figure out how to do that collectively. And if we each are doing so in a personal way, collectively, working a lot with kids as a teacher, having run an LGBTQ youth center, I stay tremendously positive because of what I see coming in the generation behind. And I'm heartbroken. Like, it's funny the way people talk to me. Like, I didn't even post when I took on the position because there's just logistically so much work to do in the background. I've just said, like, nose to the grindstone, doing the work and just make this thing happen so that we accomplish the mission for the organization, which isn't producing a parade, but is a larger mission focus and being inspired to put together sort of these 4 thematic approaches with great intention that are about telling the story of our community beyond the parades and the parties. It's funny how people reach out to me and how they talk to me when I reached out to them asking for help just as a trans community organizer over the last 5 years, and didn't get responses. But it's different now. And so we have this beautiful organization that has a tremendous reputation and reach. So the responsible thing to do as the leader of this organization, and I am serving as both the board president and as the acting executive director because we were on an ED search over a year ago that got halted because of COVID. As a board member, when we go and look forward beyond June and have a strategic planning session and go back through hiring and talk about what this organization will do in the next 5 or 10 years, the commitment to racial equity is without a doubt at the top. It has to be. And so when new folks are leaning in, they have to be committed to that. And there has not been that level of commitment ever before. Now is the time for that. And it has to happen aggressively and passionately, and in all ways. So I go back to the hopefulness of that this is one of those moments. And I'm grateful. And Rocky, I hope to connect with you anytime. Little bit in crazy crunch time, but I'd be even happy to do it now, in the craziest of times. Anytime.
Okay.
Thank you all. So we're gonna shift to Q&A from the community, people that are on. And so if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'm going to pass it over to Shaquira to lead the Q&A. Thanks for being great.
Hey, everybody. Good morning. I feel like we were just getting to the meat of it, but we are going to make the executive decision because of time, and it is 11:50, and we want to be mindful of that if you do have Q&A, you can drop them in there, and we will try to get them answered with a follow-up. But right now, I kind of want to bring us to the call to action. And I've just been notified there are no questions so far. So it sounds like you guys are doing a good job of just talking about your lived experiences. And I think everybody's just trying to digest that and take that in. So thank you all again for sharing. With that being said, we know that we can't solve this issue today. I think it's been emphasized in different ways and reiterated. And I am grateful that we were able to help begin this discussion and conversation, because there are so many other people who need to be at the table and a part of this conversation. I think that that's the next steps for most of us. So how do we do this? Like, what I would say individually to you all who have been representing on the panel, what is your call to action for the community today? If you can one line it up, and what can we do as individuals and organizations to help further this discussion and to move forward? So I'm going to start with Rocky.
Oof, gotta start me. I think, I guess just continue to try to educate each other. I think that is the biggest thing that, you know, our community needs to continue to do, because I can educate you as a Black gay male, you know, to my experience, something that you would never experience. And, you know, like Nathan will be able to educate me what it's like to be trans. That's something that I don't walk that life. So I have no experience, you know, as that, or I don't know what it's like to be a, you know, trans period, or a Black woman, or, you know, anything like that. So I feel like when we educate each other on, you know, our walks of life, it kind of creates a sense of comfort for each other, because now I know what you're experiencing, and I'm not ignorant to, you know, what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. Double tap, double click. Love that. Tamara.
To be perfectly honest, I feel like the largest burden lies on pride, and making those efforts, continuing to open those doors, continuing to make this space feel safer, continue to do things like this, to invite the community in to talk about their experiences. It's really easy to just kind of push past things like this and just keep moving forward, but you have to have this kind of space too, and be open to it and facilitate it and invite it and be willing to take the criticism, listen to it, learn from it, and build. And then on the other side, as far as the community goes, just keep showing up. Like, having people willing to share their experiences, that's how eyes get opened. You know, one person can beat a drum as loud as they want to, but a chorus of voices is very difficult to ignore. So I would say that keep showing up, keep making this an issue, because it is one. And you know, the thing that I love most about the Black community is that we always grow in whatever corner we get pushed into, no matter how dark the space. And so continuing to bloom in that corner, even if the larger space isn't always open, because it's undeniable and it's ignorable, and it's unignorable. And it also still continues to create those safe spaces that haven't been largely created for us yet. It's so important that young kids coming up will know that there's a place for them, even if there isn't a place in the big world yet. Like, we can still keep making those little spaces, and that matters. So I would say everybody just keep showing up to the table, keep having these conversations, keep speaking your truth, and be as loud as you need to be until change happens.
Got it. Thank you for that. And Nathan, your call to action to the community.
Yeah, and just keeping it personal. Do you? I think about when I would talk to my kids who want to do so much. Like, I think Tamara said this earlier. Like, you choose to do this, and I do too, and we are prepared to carry that burden. I want to interrupt and disrupt and agitate and push. And I know it's not always safe for everyone individually to do so. So finding the ways that you choose to step up, it may just be in, your circles, in your family. But if we're going to do the work, there's a lot of education. Rocky's right. And there are a lot of resources and a lot of beautiful people willing to share their experiences. That willingness to do that is, it's huge. And I go back to what we started with the video. I'm so glad we have those videos to hear those words. Like, if you just read Sylvia Rivera's speech, you would not feel the impact of her words. So when community members are sharing stories in real time, I appreciate that so much. And what I hope to do, past the craziness of the logistics nightmare of putting on a large scale event, is a whole lot of conversations and a whole lot of listening, frankly, and putting our heads together. We will have a full year of planning, and a whole lot of new partnerships have come through this year, and I want to see how those develop. I think there's some possibilities that we don't even know about yet, and I'm excited about that. But do you?
Yeah, do you? All right. I like that. I like it. Definitely like that. So now that we begin the conversation, it is up to us as a community. Thank you all for coming in, listening, and being a part of this. But now it's time to translate that into action. So don't let this go and just be a one-off, because it's not. I think we have just begun our journey to bridging the gap. And we got work to do. That's on period. So yeah, let's get to work. And I am going to pass it on to Bianca to close us out. And thank you all again from the panel to the moderation to just listening and being a part of it.
Thank you so much. Once again, we can't say thank you enough to everyone. This was such a great conversation. I think it exceeded my expectations, I think, of what this event would have been. And so we want to invite you. Can we pull up those slides, please? Awesome. So we want to invite you to support Blackout Magazine. It's Tamara, she talked about it earlier. So please feel free to subscribe. There's the handles are there, so you can go ahead and follow her there. Our next slide, please. And we have, there's also an event hosted by 9 Colors Institute. It's the Street Pride 90s party, so feel free to join. I'm sure there's more contact there. All of this is also in the YEA Collective link, in the bio. And so feel free to also go there. And one last one. And Pride Fest. You can also go to stpride.org and follow all of the events. As you heard, there's quite a few happening, so feel free to support that. Again, links are at the YEA Collective in bio, and you can feel free to follow there. I won't take any more of your time. I don't think there's much more I could say, because I probably would just damage the whole conversation. But again, thank you all. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you for your time, and we'll see you next time.